Welcome to episode 121 of Angela Watson's Truth for Teachers. I'm your host, Angela Watson, and I'm here to speak life, encouragement, and truth into the minds and hearts of educators and get you energized for the week ahead. Today, I'm going to let you listen in on a roundtable discussion with a diverse group of teachers who are sharing their best strategies for minimizing time spent on grading and assessment. Visit truthforteachers.com to see a bullet point outline of all the key concepts that we discuss and to leave your own ideas or your questions there in the comments. This episode is brought to you by Screencast-O-Matic. It's an easy-to-use screen recorder and video editor tool that makes flipped and blended learning super simple for teachers. You can record your lessons, give students video assignments, send video announcements, and more, all using either your Chromebook or your Mac or PC. There's a Screencast-O-Matic video editor too that allows you to add text and image overlays and publish your videos. So really everything that you need for production is all there right in one tool. Try out the free version now or get started with the 50% off a 1-year subscription by going to screencast-o-matic.com/teach. And Screencast-O-Matic has hyphens in it. So it's screencast-o-matic/teach. I'll put a link to it in the show notes for this episode as well. So this season of the podcast, I am trying out a new format. I've always thought that it would be really cool to get a group of master teachers together to hash out some of their toughest challenges and also to share what's really working in their classrooms. And you all know that one of the issues that I'm most passionate about is making teaching more effective, efficient, and enjoyable. So I have gathered a group of educators that I really love and respect to create a Productivity Roundtable. Joining me will be 5 members of the 40-Hour Teacher Workweek Club's graduate program. So these are teachers who have completed the full year of productivity professional development, this full year in the club. And now they're in year 2 or 3 of taking those results to the next level and really continuing to streamline. They have done a tremendous amount of work in experimenting with various productivity strategies in their classrooms and really creating systems and routines around best practices, things that work well for their students as well as for them. And the really cool thing is about this group is that they all teach at different grade levels and different subject areas. They're located in different types of school settings and communities. They're in a diverse set of locations throughout the United States. So you're going to get to hear what works within a variety of teaching contexts and teaching styles. And personally, I think it's really fascinating to have this K-12 collaboration. So you can hear what teachers in the younger grades are doing, the grades below yours, to see what kids are experiencing before they get to your classroom, as well as what the teachers in the grades above yours are doing. So you can see what you're preparing kids for. And it's just really fascinating to sort of compare and contrast how they're all applying these same principles in slightly different ways according to what works for their students' age group and their teaching context. So I think it's a really, really great discussion, and I'm super excited to let you listen in. Right now, we have 3 Productivity Roundtable sessions planned. So I'm going to be airing 2 of them this season of the podcast, and I'm going to be airing 1 next season. And if you all like this format, we can do more of these. We can either do it with the same group of teachers or with a new group, whatever. You can send me feedback. Just go to truthforteachers.com and you'll see my contact information there. Let me know if you're liking this, and we can definitely do more. So the topic for our first Productivity Roundtable is streamlining the grading and assessment process. And more specifically, how to reduce the amount of time that you spend grading papers. I chose that because it's a big struggle that just about every teacher grapples with, no matter what or where you teach. And often, we don't really know what's happening in each other's classrooms. Many teachers assume that everyone else is grading all the things, when the reality is that some of the most effective teachers, like this group of 5 that you're going to hear participating in the roundtable, they've given themselves permission to not grade everything. They have found more effective ways to monitor and assess student learning, and they're going to share those strategies here with you today. So we're going to talk about how they decide which assignments to grade and which ones not to grade. We're also going to talk about what they do with the work that they don't grade. And they're going to share how they're using formative assessment and student self-assessment to reduce the amount of grades that they have to assign and to make the assessment process more meaningful for kids. And we'll wrap up by sharing their best hacks and time-saving tips related to grading and assessment. So this is going to be a longer episode, but I'm telling you, this stuff is gold, especially if you're a new teacher and you feel completely lost. Really, I mean, who doesn't feel completely lost sometimes with grading and assessment, right? You can be in the classroom for 30 years and still feel like this is a huge struggle. I think this episode is just gold. Like, the advice here is so practical, and I love how vulnerable and transparent they are. There's no sugarcoating things here. You're going to hear their real struggles and what's working and what's not. So without further ado, I'm going to let you go ahead and listen in now on this first Productivity Roundtable session. Let's start off by having you introduce yourselves and share the most impactful strategy or mindset shift that you've discovered for reducing the amount of time that you spend grading papers.
My name is Nicole Guzman, and I teach in Provo, Utah. I teach 5th grade. The most impactful strategy that I've discovered has been making feedback immediate whenever possible and only recording summative assessments as grades. I found that most of the things that we do are much more effective when we give immediate feedback. And as a bonus, when I give that feedback in class rather than at home, I spend a lot less time on it and my students benefit more from it.
That's great. My name is Erin Palazzo. I teach high school English at Shrewsbury High School. I currently teach mostly advanced placement English language, and I also teach sophomores. I think the biggest thing for me, because I grade so many essays and different types of writing, is figuring out a way to make the grading of essays go quicker. And so I have to thank Dave Stewart Jr. for this one. I can't take credit for it, but I now keep my cell phone out on the table next to me and a sticky note. And I have the cell phone open to the stopwatch feature. Everything else is disabled, thanks to Angela's reminders about staying on track. And then for the stopwatch feature, I start it, and when I finish grading a paper, I hit the lap timer, which keeps track of laps, but for me, it's keeping track of how long it took me to actually grade a paper. And that helps me stay on pace. So if I can grade a paper in, let's say, 3 minutes a paper or 5 minutes a paper, or whatever it is, it helps me know I said I have got an hour and I want to grade X number of papers. I know that I'm staying on track rather than starting to slow down or get distracted or pulled into social media. And then I use the sticky note rather than making comments on every single paper. As soon as I see trends, which happens pretty quickly, I will write that down on the sticky note to address it in class the next day. So I might do a mini lesson on, we need to learn on using illustrative examples, show, don't tell, or a bunch of you had awkward phrasing and we're going to work on that. So rather than writing those phrases over and over again, I just have them once on a sticky note. And then lastly, I try and pull exemplar essays to help the students learn from each other. So I just put a little star at the top so that way I can collect them out of the stack easily the next day.
Okay, my name is Kevin O'Shaughnessy. I teach in Wells, Maine. I've been teaching for 16 years at Wells High School, and I currently teach a required sophomore history course called The World After 1945 and a senior elective AP Psychology. So one of the biggest mind shift strategies has been the weekly planner to allot my grading time. It sort of dovetails with the whole idea of batching, but I really take a much harder look now at what I have to grade during the week, and then when I can grade it. So I want to create, chunks of time, or at least little bits of time, depending on the assignment that I know I've got to grade. And if I can see that I'm getting bogged down with grading, I try to cut as much as possible while still getting the learning evidence that I need. So the other thing I wanted to mention too was I feel like one of Angela, your biggest takeaways for me was, like, if something isn't working and it's the middle of the year, don't grit your teeth and ride it out till the end of the year, but actually change it on the fly, because you want to use that time to actually know if what you want to do is working. And so planning ahead and then setting aside time to grade each week, and then trying new things while you're still in school really helped.
That makes sense. Hello, my name is Osa Oyegun, and I'm a first grade homeroom teacher in Manhattan, New York. I teach language arts, social studies, and math. And I'd have to say that the most impactful strategy that I found for reducing time spent marking student work was to teach my students self and peer editing skills. And this is something that they practice over and over again at the beginning of the year. It's particularly helpful with homework. We incorporate marking our homework together during morning meetings, and I give them the answers and they mark, and then we discuss the work and reflect on it. So I myself only mark student work when I'm assessing a skill that I've recently taught. And the rest of the time, the students mark their own work using answer keys that I prepare for them. I think the only reason I was able to get to this point was that I joined the club, and that made it possible for me to have a mind shift change in terms of understanding that I didn't have to look over absolutely every piece of work that my students generated, particularly because they're so young and they try so hard. And, I sit there and just try to understand what they'd written. And once I came to that understanding that it was okay to only look for certain things in particular pieces of work, it became easier to practice being intentional about the work that I gave to the students. Even if it was just, a fun activity, I try to make sure that there's always an intent behind it. For example, improving fine motor skills.
My name is Desiree Nunez, and I teach 4th grade in California. I wanted to share that one of the most impactful strategies that I use to reduce the amount of grading I have is to decide during the lesson planning process if the skills that I'm working on are meant to be more practice or if a formal assessment is even needed. Sometimes at the end of the lesson, I may change my original decision based on how the students did, if they show me they need more time or less time than I anticipated. Also, after learning more through the club, I grade way less than before in general. So just having less on my plate reduces the time as well.
Yeah, I think that's really one of the most critical understandings for a lot of teachers in the 40-Hour Teacher Workweek Club, even though it can be really hard to wrap your mind around, is that you don't need to grade every single assignment. And as you said, actually, you don't even need to closely examine every single piece of work that students do. Some of it is just for practice. So I advise teachers to grade only the things that are a true and accurate measure of what students know and are able to do. So grading practice work in a student's first few attempts at a new skill is often unnecessary, and it's a waste of your time. Some things are just for practice. They don't need to be formally assessed. And I've found that a lot of teachers aren't sure exactly of what's required of them in this area. And oftentimes they're surprised to discover that their district either doesn't have a minimum number of grades they have to take, or else the minimum is a very reasonable number, like 2 grades per subject per week. That's what I was required to do when I taught in South Florida. So in a 9-week quarter, that's 18 grades per subject. And if you grade just those 18 or even 19 or 20 things that students do each quarter, which are the most true and accurate measure of what they know and are able to do, then you've cut down your grading workload significantly without being unfair to students. And I think sometimes teachers are nervous about doing this because they're afraid that not taking enough grades is going to pull down students' averages. But I know from experience, from doing this myself for 11 years in the classroom, that it doesn't have to have a negative effect on students' averages if you're grading the right things. If you're grading the things that are a true and accurate measure of what they know and they're able to do. So I'd like to have you all share how you decide which assignments are going to be given a formal grade and which ones you're not going to grade. Can you speak to that a little bit?
So I only grade things that are summative assessments. As far as formative assessment, I use that to just drive my instruction and kind of immediately decide what am I going to do for reteaching and things like that. But most work, I only track as collected or missing. My kids need that accountability. But we use standards-based report cards. I've used standards-based for most of my career. And what a lot of teachers get wrong on this is they don't realize that you don't want an average of everything you've ever done on the topic. You just want a measurement of where they're at currently. So if I'm at the end of term and it's time to do report cards, I'm going to take more grades than at the beginning of term when they're just learning a concept. So kind of echoing what you said, Angela. It doesn't give me an accurate reflection if it's earlier on in the learning. So I do tend to record more grades later in the term, and so that I can get a really accurate reflection for where they're at. And so I mainly, if it's not summative, then I don't usually record it.
I think I just say pretty much the same thing. I tend to use the timing of the work we're doing to help me decide what to mark. For example, if we're in the middle of a unit or learning a new skill, chances are I won't mark any work produced during that period, but may use that data for anecdotal records or to inform my lessons within the coming days in terms of whether or not the children are struggling to understand a concept. I tend to, because we have standards-based report cards as well, I tend to mark summative work at the end of a unit. And I may extend our practice based on, what I've seen in the classroom. But I have some leeway in terms of what I choose to mark. So I really try to be very concise with my choices.
For me, at the high school level, one of the things that I try and really embrace, excuse me, is the notion of having them write way more than I could possibly grade. And I find that another really helpful approach is to give the students the empowerment in their grades. And so I'll often have them practice a skill several times and then allow them to be the ones to pick which version would you like me to grade. For example, my students wrote 2 different op-ed pieces on 2 different topics, and then they picked the one that they were most pleased with, the one they thought was the best example of the skills and argument that we were practicing at that point in time. I also try and look at it from a skills perspective. So what am I trying to assess? And although we're not at a standards-based report card, trying to see if there are ways that I can move the grades more towards those final summative, or in English language arts, where there are so many different aspects of communication, combining the skills together. So if I teach them grammatical concepts, like how to use commas, for example, I don't do worksheets and check those and give those a grade and then have a commas quiz and grade that. I really try and save it for the practical application. So it's graded in more of a real world setting, and it's also graded with other things in conjunction. So rather than grading it 3 different ways, I'm waiting till the end to grade. And so I find that really helps them to feel empowered because they have a little bit of control over proving that they've mastered the skills on the content. And then it gives me some flexibility to really tailor what they still need to work on based on where we're at within the grading period.
I also teach high school, and Maine always has an eye on Massachusetts. And we're sort of, we keep track of the standards that our assessments are too, but we're still using a formal number grading system. So for stuff that's in the classroom or quizzes or things like that, that's only 20% of and homework is only 20% of my overall grade. So a lot of that grading can be handled with, I have a rubber stamp that has thumbs up, thumbs sideways, and thumbs down. And so I use that for stuff that I feel like I want you to do this, but it's not going to be as impactful on your grade as the major assessments. I also ask myself, because I've been in this situation, and I think a lot of teachers have, you'll have a student that transfers into your class or comes from another school, and you just say, if I had to say in the middle of the unit, what does this kid need to do to catch up or to get in the flow of the unit, that's going to be your summative assessments. So my breakouts for grades are like 20% for quizzes, homework, and in-class stuff. Research is 20%. 30% is projects, major projects, Socratic seminars that also have an essay with that. And then there's a unit test at the end. And so I'll look at my assessments and say, okay, if I've got to pick I can't just bury this kid with everything. Mm-hmm. So I'm going to I'm going to cut that stuff down. I'm going to triage the important stuff. And that's the stuff that really, if I can do that in my head with a kid who's moved here, from another district, then I should be able to do that with my grading time too. And so I'll look at that and say, what do I want to know? Well, I want to know, can they do research? Can they do the writing for the Socratic seminar, take a position and defend it? Do they know the content well enough to do well on a unit test? So if you can answer that question for a kid, you should answer it for yourself too and say, where do I want to spend my time? And it's going to be on the big stuff. The not that the everyday stuff isn't important, but you're setting the table so that they can do well and succeed. It's your scaffolding. But in the end, the learning evidence is going to be those major assessments. Just look at the percentages or the weights that you give things or the standards that you have to meet, and take a really hard look at that and say, okay, what's going to give me the best picture? And then that's where I want to spend my time. I don't want to spend it just grading a bunch of stuff that really isn't going to be all that valuable for giving me that overall big picture.
Mm-hmm. I think it's going to be very freeing for other teachers to hear you all share that you're not grading every single assignment and you've figured out systems that work better for you and really for your students too. This isn't just about benefiting you, it's working better for them as well. But I think a lot of people listening to this are going to be thinking, okay, that sounds good in theory. I like this idea, but what exactly do you do with the assignments that you don't grade? So I'm wondering if any of you can speak to that. And let's be real here. Do any of these papers end up in the recycling bin?
Well, I think that's the dirty little secret, right? That we don't want to admit that every precious paper is not given 20 minutes of attention. But the truth is, I take advantage of, we call it the circular filing cabinet, right? I take advantage of that because seriously, sometimes the practice was valuable in and of itself.
Yes.
I'm trying to find a really good balance. I don't want the carrot of the grade to be the only reason my students are doing the work. So I think that takes some upfront practice in terms of my teaching and my delivery. Why are we doing this? What's the payout in terms of the summative assessments that'll be coming down the pike? But also, as an English teacher, I try to focus on the practical application of the different communication skills we're working on so that they can see the value in the assignment, even if they know up front, I'm not going to be grading this, that it's just practice. The other thing that I think about is trying to have my students work in small groups to give peer feedback and to have those reflective conversations, even if they're not getting that from me. And I find that can often lead to the most growth because they can talk with each other about how they grew, what they tried. Someone else tried something different and they learned from that. Maybe they'll try that technique the next time around. Because like Kevin just said, my grades are set up in category weights as well. And I have a lot of freedom and flexibility in how many grades I give and how I set up those categories. I want to be careful not to be grading things for the sake of grading everything and end up with a ton of grades that are just getting completion credit and therefore inflating their grades.
I can echo a lot of what Erin just said. As I mentioned before, my students do need some level of accountability. And so I do have a system in place to account for that. But my gradebooks program allows for me to mark assignments as complete or missing. And so for those things that aren't just we're reviewing it together and it's going in the recycle bin, that they need that accountability that I really needed them to do that, but it's not quite a summative grade. Then I'll just mark it as collected or missing. But I don't put a single mark on those papers. Those papers, they still end up in the recycle bin, usually. Some of them I'll hand back to the students and give them the option to just take it home to share with their parents what they're doing. I also have the benefit of one-to-one technology. So we do a lot digitally as well, and that saves on the paper shuffle. So that helps there. But most paper assignments go home or they go in the recycle bin.
So I think I'd like to blame parents for the fact that I used to recycle a lot of student work in the past, just because independent school parents of young children tend to be very anxious. And sometimes I'd look at a student's work and knowing the parent, I'd go, right, I don't want to put that in the student's portfolio, so I'm not going to keep it. And since joining the club, that happens less and less. I think because over the years, I've realized that being the teacher of young children usually means that you're educating the parents as well in terms of what it means for a child to make progress and the joy derived from them just sitting and looking at their work and the progressive nature of all of their hard work and what the beginning product was and what the ending product can look like. So I rarely end up recycling student work these days. In fact, what usually ends up happening is if there's any work that goes in the recycling bin, it's usually some products that I was really, really excited about, and then I print it out, and I'm standing in the middle of my classroom questioning whether it's something that I really need to have my students doing, in terms of trying to be intentional about the work, or whether it was something that looked, really good on Teachers Pay Teachers. So, I think anything that I don't mark, I have the students mark themselves, and then it goes in the portfolio, or they just end up never seeing it at all. I never give it to them.
A lot of good things have been said here. I'm proud of the fact that I recycle now. I have a fire pit and a wood burning stove, so all of those things have been implemented. And it's not a dirty little secret. I have helped other teachers by just saying, like, just bury that or burn it or whatever, especially when they're bogged down. Because the reality is, if you're assessing stuff so much to the point that you're losing sleep and you're not focused, you're not going to teach well. And I've had the really good fortune to have a colleague, and now we're actually teaching a course using video to help instruction. And we were both talking, and he's been teaching even longer than I have. And he said, we're all into assessment now. We're just so much into assessment. And yet, really, the most important thing that goes on in teaching is what happens in the classroom. And that's the most important thing. And we are in danger of losing sight of that because of all this, standards and learning evidence and all that other stuff. So all that, keep that in mind, like what you do with the kids, the relationship you have, that stuff is really the most important. A lot of times I'll say, and I try to mix it up to keep my load a little lighter. And I also want to, because I have high school students, I kind of have to keep them guessing. So I'll say, nope, this time you're not going to hand it in. Just keep it in your notebook because it's going to help you with writing your essay, or keep it for your project because that's going to help you do your research or something like that. So that's one option. And you've got to vary that depending on the class and your kids, and for some strange reason, I find that where the kids are really that struggle with independent work, when they're doing worksheets, that seems to calm them down and they focus and they do that. So that might be the way that you get to them that way. And then maybe you do need to assess those a little bit more than normal. The other thing I would say is one of the biggest things you can do is circulate around while they're doing something. So you might be able to actually just look and say, I have a roster, I have a clipboard, and clipboards greatly enhance your credibility. Always carry a clipboard. It looks like you know what you're doing. But when you do that, you can go around and just basically look and just put check marks off where they're at. That way, when they hand it in, you've already really assessed it and said, yes, this kid did it. And the other piece to that puzzle, too, is if you have those kids that struggle or are easily off task, those are the ones that you're going to circle back to and check in with right away and go back to a couple of times. So that's, there's ways to, finesse it so that you don't have to, fill up the wood stove or the fire pit. But I'm not saying I haven't used it. I'm not going to lie.
Those are really great points, Kevin. And I think that just because you're not assigning a formal grade to a student, that doesn't mean you're just sitting back and you're just hoping that they're learning and you're just going to wait and see at the end of the unit test. I mean, what you're talking about there is it's a lot of formative assessment. It's ongoing assessment. And I think that the effective and appropriate way to reduce your grading workload involves trying to move towards more formative assessment and making the shift to thinking more about where students are in the mastery process each day rather than waiting to take a grade at the end or looking for these more formal assignments. So in many of the most effective teachers' classrooms, there might be less grading happening, but there's more assessment. You actually have a better idea of where your students are at each day because you're using this formative assessment. So I'm wondering if you all can share what's the easiest or the most impactful strategy that you've tried for formative assessment so that you know what kids are mastering without having to give them formal quizzes and tests and these other things that you have to sit down and assign a grade to?
I'll just pick up where Kevin left off because a big thing for me too is just walking around the room. I have my students situated in tables of about 4 or 5 students each, and I try and foster a really collaborative classroom environment. And so a lot of times I ask them, I always feel like the simpler the strategy, the better it is. And I try and keep things to a few key simple strategies that work really well. So back to the old think, pair, share from our days of education classes in college. And so I'll have the students reflect on maybe it's a reading they did for homework or something we're working on, or they've just gotten a paper back. And I'll have them talk in their table groups. And so I'll just wander around and listen. And as Kevin said, you kind of know the kids you want to really hone in on to hear what they have to say because they've been struggling. I've really gotten good at mastering the art of listening to 2 groups at the same time, or standing and pretending like I'm listening to one group, but I'm actually eavesdropping on the group behind them so they don't feel like I'm listening in on their conversation and they get nervous. I get some pretty good, accurate reads that way. If it's something that's more straightforward, or I just want like a quick 3, 2, 1, how do you feel about this? We're also a one-to-one iPad school. And so I love using Google Forms. I know there are all kinds of apps and Angela has plugged, which fascinate me, the idea of clickers and different things like that. Again, I try and keep it simple. I try and keep it minimal to the number of apps and programs and things I'm having the kids go to, because I can imagine how confusing it must be for the kids to jump around. So I'll just put out a Google form. And what I love about that is that when I look at it, Google will present the information. So if I have them rate their confidence in something, it'll put it in a pie chart for me. I don't have to do anything. Or I can get the information in a spreadsheet, and then I can filter the spreadsheet based on the class period or based on the kids' responses. That sorts kids into differentiated instruction groups. And it's a really great way if I have, again, short or pretty objective rating type things I want to formatively assess to get that information and then use it practically.
So in contrast to Erin, in the elementary setting, you do want to have a few more strategies up your sleeve when you're teaching the same group of kids all day long to keep them interested and engaged. That being said, I do have a few favorites that I use for formative assessment. A question on Google Classroom is one that I love when I want to see something a little more open-ended. And then that also gives me the chance for peer feedback as well, as they'll respond to each other's answers. And so they actually get a benefit out of that as well. We do simple things like jotting it down on a Post-it note. I'll say, give them a multiple choice question and show me 1 finger for A, 2 fingers for B. So on the fly a lot, I'll use that. Before I had one-to-one Chromebooks, I did use Plickers a lot. But when I reflected on what is the most impactful strategy, I really have to go simple with this one. So I guess like Erin in that sense. But my go-to is exit tickets. I think it's a simple thing, but so effective. They do their exit ticket. So if it's math, it's some sort of math problem. Reading, might be some sort of response. And so they bring it to me. And as they hand them in, they come and line up, they hand them in, and I just sort them into 2 piles, one for mastery and one for those who need reteaching. So sometimes the simple solutions are the most effective.
I agree. In fact, I've kind of gone full circle on this. One of the podcasts that Angela had was the authors of Total Participation Techniques, and I bought the book, and I kind of went from I've used Poll Everywhere, and I've used Pear Deck, and the problem with teenagers is once you let them use their phones again, it's hard to get them to stop using their phones. And so I had to figure out then you had to plan when can I do this so that this is the only thing we're going to do till the end of class, because once the phones come out, it's just bedlam. And reading that book, I went back to things like Think, Pair, Share, but then having them partner up with somebody, they use the appointment book strategy. I'll just let them move off of their tables. But then I have whiteboards in the, like a white wall essentially in the back of my room. And I would have them write the most important thing that they shared or the most important thing they've learned. So what I like about that is it makes the thinking visible. You're getting an assessment of what they know, what they're taking away, and you're incorporating movement. And getting movement into a high school classroom is so important because they're sitting there for the bulk of the day and it's not good. So, it doesn't matter once you hit 15 or 16 or 36, your attention span is really about 20 minutes. And then you need some kind of, shifting of gears to really reset your focus. And so I'll schedule those breaks. We teach 54-minute classes because nothing can ever end in a 5 and a 0. I'll look at 20, 25 minutes in and I'm like, okay, I got to have it here. And it's got to be a think, pair, share, but it's got to have movement in it. I got to get them up. So I want them writing and I want them moving, and then I'm able to do an assessment that way. So that's the way I look at it. I like those a little better than, it's sort of like the middle of the class exit ticket, because then I'm checking in and I'm saying, what have you learned so far? And I'm also giving them a chance to move around and talk and do that stuff. And it's easier to bring them back if they aren't using their phones. I love the technology, and believe me, they do too, but you've really got to pick your spots with teenagers because, you lose that last 20 minutes of class if you're fighting about cell phones. So
I go back and forth in terms of, whether or not in terms of being glad that my kids are too young to be able to use technology. And then just some days knowing that all of these apps are out there that I could try if I were teaching an older grade. But in the past, I have used exit tickets with third graders, and those have worked really well. I've also used KWLs, which are, what I know, what I want to know, and what I'd like to know, what I want to learn. With my first graders, I tend to do that whole class because there's less pressure on them in terms of writing. And if I had them write it independently, then I would be expecting them to do 2 things, which is to write to write in a way that's comprehensible to someone else, as well as to show me what they know, and that can be a lot for a 6-year-old. So we'll do a whole class session where I'm doing the writing and they're just giving me their answers. But the easiest way I found in terms of collecting information from them is to do this thing called Fist to 4, where at the beginning of a lesson, I'll ask them, and at the end, I'll ask them to show me their understanding, where they'll hold up 4 fingers for mastery, and they can teach it to someone else. 3, they understand, but aren't quite confident to teach someone else. And that's something I use for the duration of our lesson every single day. So if they're working in the classroom and I'm walking around observing them, I can give them a quiet signal to ask if they need my help, or if there's something they're struggling with, then perhaps I can make a suggestion. In terms of 6-year-olds wanting to show that they need help, I think they become a little bit anxious sometimes. So Fist of Four is a really great way of them giving me a signal, and they don't feel judged for it by their friends. I think the other thing is that in my school, students are expected to be able to explain their thinking on a regular basis. So we do have lots of individual, small, and whole group discussions. And that gives me a lot of information in terms of what a student knows and how deep their understanding of a concept or learning has been.
Oh, this is so good. I'm really enjoying it. So one of my favorite ways to reduce the grading workload and rely more on formative assessment is by giving kids more ownership of the assessment process. And we all know firsthand that student self-assessment is really powerful. So teaching kids how to analyze the quality of their work and their own mastery of skills really just tends to be much more meaningful for kids than just getting back this sheet of paper that already has the grade on it. And then they just, what do they even do? They crumple it up and throw it in the trash can. They don't even read the comments, right? So it doesn't have to be a really difficult process to train kids in self-assessment. And I'm wondering how you've used student self-assessment to cut down on your workload and also to empower kids to take responsibility for the learning and for the assessment.
So I already touched on this a little bit, but I really do try and emphasize having the students write more than I see or grade. And in my AP classes, we do a lot of practice essays gearing up for the AP exam in May. So I often have my students start with writing the outline and then picking a body paragraph to write. And then we move on to, okay, we're going to practice 2 of these timed essays in class, but then you'll look over them, you'll get feedback from peers, and you'll pick one that you feel most confident in to submit. And I find that the time the students take to reflect on their own work and evaluate their quality is so powerful. And time again, that's what helps them improve the next time around. I would say almost more so than any feedback that I'm able to write at the top of their paper. Mm-hmm. It gives them a better perspective so that even if we do need to conference after, they have a clearer understanding of their strengths and weaknesses. And I also really try and encourage risk-taking with these students. I really want them thinking outside the box in terms of their ideas. I want them stretching away from formulaic type writing. And this takes some of the pressure off of them in terms of grading. So they know that if they take a risk in their writing and try something new and it fails, it's okay, because they won't necessarily have to turn that in. And so that also is helping them improve their writing in leaps and bounds because they're able to take those risks, self-assess, and then think about how that played out for them. And that's really, really powerful.
I also teach AP students, my AP psychology students, and I've had more success with them doing self-assessment. But what I've done is really boil down the essence of what I want them to know. So I'll give them a writing prompt that is based on the writing section of the psychology exam, but I'll do the easy, or I'll give them the part about recalling what the term means. And then I'll say, okay, apply it to this situation. So I'll give them a term and an example and say, okay, here's a situation. How do these 2 things relate to each other? And from a Bloom standpoint or from a cognitive standpoint, that's the highest level of thinking. So I get away from the recall or anything. I'm not trying to create a gotcha situation, but I'm saying, okay, I'm giving you all the tools. You've got to apply them to the situation. When I do that, it's more of a comfortable thing for them to sort of self-assess when we go over it. And those kind of kids are the ones who want to know, am I doing this well enough to get points on the exam? When it's a more formal situation, then I will do peer editing because, I'm going to have them write their essay, like an entire essay based on recall, the whole thing when we get closer to the exam. And then I'm going to say, you've got to switch with somebody and they've got to read it and see if what you've written actually is communicated effectively to another person. And we'll go through that. But it's time consuming. And I'll be honest, of all the things we've talked about, this is the thing that I as a teacher, I have struggled with the most. It is wonderful in theory. I have when I'm dealing with sophomores or when I taught freshmen, they really struggle with both self-assessment and peer editing because, maybe I didn't teach it well, or it's very hard for them to grade a friend accurately. It's very hard for them to look at their own writing critically. And I can tell you, from my own personal experience, I'm not a great self-editor. I always need somebody else to look at my stuff. So that part of it, I always, struggle with. So I try to really boil it down and say, okay, in what situation am I going to do it? And then how am I going to have them assess? When I get them to a point where they can do it, it is effective. But you've really got to commit to a lot of class time to really teach that skill to those kids. That's my sort of caveat with all of this is for at least high school kids, I find it's a skill they really need to have taught over and over again. You've got to go back to it, and it's going to be one of your themes of the course for that entire year.
The challenge that Kevin brings up is definitely probably the most intimidating thing of self-assessment, I think, is that it is something that has to be explicitly taught, the process of how to do that in order for them to do it effectively. And it does take a lot of class time because it takes a lot of practice. It really wasn't until a few years ago that I said, okay, I really see the benefit of this. I am going to commit to improving this in my classroom. And so I've tried out a variety of things, but I think a couple of things that really affect the success of it. First of all, the students need a very clear understanding of their goal and where it is that they're going and what exactly success is going to look like. So I use rubrics and checklists to help them to do that, so that they can go step by step and, okay, we're looking for this or we're looking for that. The side effect of those rubrics and checklists is it also helps them to give better quality peer feedback. So not only can they get farther without me, but then they can help their peers get even farther. I've also implemented a lot of reflections and journaling type things. So I've used some different forms. I've done it as an actual spiral bound journal that I've done. I've just done paper pencil. I currently use digital with one-to-one. And I've just created a template that they use. And they track their progress, and then they reflect and write, how are they doing on that? And what is it that they need to improve in order to be more successful next time? So by using this type of reflection, they become better at advancing their own learning, which is really exciting to see even in younger grades. Another thing that I really love, a tool that I love, is Seesaw. I use that as a digital portfolio, but the trick that I use with that is they love to add things to Seesaw, but when they want to add something, they're required to add a caption that reflects on that piece. So the bonus to all this of these journals and teaching them how to be more successful at self-assessing is that it completely sets up student-led conferences for me. I end up having to do very little work in that arena because it's already there and saves me even more time.
I think you're absolutely right, Nicole. In the past, I have used student reflections to get them thinking about their learning. My current class isn't at that point yet, but we have been practicing self-sufficiency and just becoming more independent from the beginning of the year. And I guess that's easier to start when you've got younger students, because that is your whole goal, is to get them to become more independent day by day, and whether it's by setting up routines for autonomy in the classroom, where to put finished and unfinished work, so that you don't have 5 students coming up to you asking what to do when they're finished. All sorts of little ways that make it easier for them to then be able to look at their work and practice thinking critically. And one of the things that I've done this year is to create a folder for when they're writing, And, it's called our Author at Work folder. They feel very important when they pick this up, like they're really at work. And it's got things for them that help them, all the phonemes that we've learned this year, and sight words for spelling, and a handwriting chart for correct letter formation, and then 5-star writing for things to look for when you think you're finished writing, because that's always an issue. I'm done. Now come look over my work. And it's like, nope, I did that at the beginning of the year. And now you're going to look over your work because this is something we've practiced all year together as a class. And here are the things we're looking for, what punctuation is, that you need to capitalize every sentence and things like that. I really liked what Kevin said about giving all the tools, because I think essentially that's what we try to do in the lower elementary classroom, setting up those routines and then giving them these things that they practice every day, looking through their work. I think it ends up showing in the quality of their work, in terms of them really starting to transfer those critical thinking skills and trying to go a little bit deeper day by day. Something that we've done from the beginning of the year is to invite the parents to come in twice a month, to come either, be in the classroom community with the children, or to take a look at their work. And from the beginning of the year, I've had the children practice putting their work away in their portfolios. And of course, the first couple of times we did that, it was really difficult because they didn't know how to handle the papers or the folders, the binders, everything. And now we've gotten to the point at the middle of the year where they can do all of that within 5 minutes. And that really makes me glad, because I think, practicing all of these skills and then learning to assess their writing, learning to assess their reading, using the language that I've been teaching them all year, you can see it come together in other areas. And that's how you know that, you're doing a good job, and that self-assessment is actually a skill that maybe ought to be on the report card.
Yeah.
Another way I've cut down on my workload and even empowered students to take responsibility for their own learning is by using the visual learning strategies I've learned through our district training. Through this training, I've been able to alter my rubrics. For example, instead of the students simply finding where they fit in on the criteria, because I often think they are higher than they actually are. Each of the criteria requires them to underline, highlight, or circle where in their work they met that specific expectation. This makes it visually quick and easy for both the students and I to see where they fall in the rubric and exactly what they can do to move themselves up.
Such good points there about teaching kids to self-assess. You all have shared some awesome strategies and insights here today. I want to close up with a lightning round. So just super quick answers of just 1 to 2 sentences about what is your best hack for grading and assessment.
So I would say that if you give homework every day, like I did last year to 35 children, just make marking homework a part of your morning routine. And do it together as a class and discuss it. And it actually becomes one of the most joyful things that you can do together as a class. There's no anxiety about it. The children love it, and you've saved yourself lots of time.
I say utilize technology. So whether it's Google Forms, Socrative, GoFormative, whatever it is, the time that you take setting up an assessment that self-grades, it more than gets paid back in the time that you don't spend grading it.
The best hack I've learned for grading is Angela's tip of grading the same question at once for all the assessments instead of grading a whole test one at a time. This has really helped get through the work faster since my brain isn't needing to readjust as many times and essentially task switching.
My number one go-to is stamps. My high schoolers go crazy over stamps. It's so funny to see 17-year-old boys get excited over a stamp at the top of their paper, but I can check it quickly for completion at the beginning of class, and we can spend time in class going over the work, talking about it, and I don't have to worry about if kids were sneaking in answers afterwards. I know that it's done, and that what I collect at the end of our discussion is valid.
It was great because today I knew I had the podcast and I had several students complain that I didn't use the rubber stamp on their work. I would say collaborate. If you can get a veteran teacher to collaborate with, or at least talk to about a topic, particularly somebody in your same content, like those are the resources. They've made all the mistakes. That's one of the most important things that we can do. The other thing I would say, just remember that grading is really a language of communication. That's all it really is. And so you're just trying to find a way to talk to parents and kids about how their child is, and whether it's a number or a standard, keep that in mind. That's what it is. And that's what you're using it for.
So there you have it, our first Productivity Roundtable. Look out for another episode with this amazing group of teachers later in this podcast season, and they're going to be sharing their best tech tips. You're going to hear how they're using tech tools to help them save time, as well as their strategies for managing the online aspects of their work, like email overload and grading digitally submitted assignments, and all sorts of great stuff related to tech. I would love your feedback on the Productivity Roundtable format. You can click the link in the show notes of your podcast player, or just go to truthforteachers.com and find episode 121. You can leave a comment there and let us know what you think, what was helpful, what we can do to make these roundtable discussions even more valuable for you. Your takeaway truth for the week ahead is a reminder to grade only the assignments which are a true and accurate measure of what your students know and what they're able to do. Give yourself permission to stop grading everything and start grading only the most important things. Have a great week. You can do this. And remember, it's not going to be easy. It's going to be worth it. Want more than just a weekly podcast episode from me? I'd love to also send you a weekly message of encouragement via email. I'll reach out each Sunday evening with a short message that's designed to help you feel more prepared and inspired and motivated for the week ahead. It's not a newsletter or a bunch of announcements. This goes out to over 85,000 educators. So I put just as much thought into crafting this weekly written message to my email list as I do into crafting my podcast episodes. And it's entirely unique content that you won't find anywhere else online. Just go to thecornerstoneforteachers.com/subscribe and you can sign up. That's thecornerstoneforteachers.com/subscribe.